Unlike Call of Duty, Battlefield isn't particularly known for their single-player offerings. The series started out as a massively online multiplayer shooter that just happened to add a single-player campaign later down the line, along with the bigger package. Battlefield started to implement a proper single-player story mode with the release of Company. Now yes, Battlefield 2 Modern Combat had a single-player campaign of a unique sort, but it wasn't exactly a fully fledged mode or a proper campaign that we'd see from the likes of Call of Duty, Halo, or even Killzone. And for the series' first proper single-player outing, it was a hit. With a wacky military story driven by a memorable and likable cast of characters and some mostly fun explosive gameplay. Bad Company 2 had a much more polished campaign that was a little more serious, but still had those memorable character moments filled with some downright hilarious dialogue. The level design was improved but had a lot less open-endedness than Bad Company and Modern Combat. Then what followed was ultimately a single-player experience meant to serve as more of a tech demo for EA's, at the time, brand new Frostbite engine. Any open-endedness from previous campaigns was stripped down to a generic linear military shooter campaign filled with scripted and occasional quick-time events. Half of the Battlefield fans that played through the campaign hated it, while the other slightly lesser half saw it as iconic, epic, and kind of good. And to this day, there are still some people debating over whether the campaign was underrated or just plain cookie cutter. I'll say this, the campaign is underrated in certain aspects, and kind of less than decent in others. In this video, I'll be looking at these aspects and opinions that make Battlefield 3's campaign so controversial, infamous, and divisive within the Battlefield community and overall fan base. The story has you playing three characters, primarily Sergeant Henry Blackburn, secondarily Dima Mayakovsky, and lastly Sergeant Jonathan Miller. Honorable mention to Miss Wedge Hawkins though. The game opens in an unnecessary medias res, where Blackburn is seen escaping from somewhere and jumps off a bridge onto a train where we meet the main antagonist of the game, Solomon. We're taken back in time where we're properly introduced to Blackburn as he is seen in military detention for interrogation by Gordon and Kovic, with Kovic being a character we'll be seeing in Battlefield 4 again. Now the story structure doesn't follow in chronological order, but I'll be briefly retelling it in said chronological order. March of 2014, Blackburn and the boys head to Iraqi Kurdistan to find a US military crew who are looking into an explosive device. They were last located in the territory of the PLR, fully known as the People's Liberation and Resistance. Blackburn's squad gets ambushed and we fight our way to the city before an earthquake hits, knocking out Blackburn. He wakes up hours later and sneaks past some PLR bogies until we group him with Montez and other surviving members. The PLR stage a coup by killing Sergeant Miller and the US invades. Lieutenant Jennifer Hawkins is involved in an air raid over Iran and an airstrike over the Mera airport. Blackburn and his boys are sent into Tehran for battle damage assessment. They got a hold of al-Bashir, who is working with Solomon but is later betrayed after Blackburn and company check an underground bank, find a suitcase that holds 3 portable nukes, but 2 are missing. Al-Bashir tells the crew of Solomon's plan and they get intel on Solomon's arms dealer, Kafarov. Dima and his Spetsnaz squad beat them to it, taking out Kafarov in the process. Blackburn arrives at Kafarov's villa where he lies dead, and this is when we're chronologically introduced to the best character in the Battlefield series, Dima. For the climax, Dima tells Blackburn Solomon's plan to detonate 2 portable nukes in 2 locations, New York and Paris. But there's a twist though. The 2 portable nukes are being moved around via metro systems. Captain Cole encounters Blackburn and Dima as Cole threatens Dima down on the ground. Blackburn shoots Cole, which ends up being the reason for Blackburn's detention. Dima and his GRU squad head to Paris to stop the nuke, but ultimately fail and the nuke kills around 80,000 people.
же херня, бля! Это же пустышка, это не ядерное оружие, бля! Топор лишнему, где факел?
Blackburn escapes from detention with Montez to stop the nuke from blowing up in Times Square, and Blackburn succeeds but loses Montez as he finally kills Solomon. In an epilogue, it shows that Demon survived the nuke but is suffering from radiation poisoning. He writes and talks about the heroic efforts that him and Blackburn performed to defeat Solomon. He hears a knock on the door and he cocks his pistol. The premise of Battlefield 3's campaign is quite solid and unique. I like how it spins the concept of stopping a nuclear weapon on its head a bit. Instead of a bunch of US soldiers heading to a Russian base and disarming a nuclear warhead, in Battlefield 3 it's 2 US soldiers and a trio of Russian mercenaries who have to find and stop 2 mobile nukes that are being moved around via trains. It raises the stakes and thrills quite uniquely and I absolutely love it. What was also refreshing is how Russians are portrayed in this game. Call of Duty and other military shooters had a knack of shamelessly painting all Russians as the bad guys. But in Battlefield 3, 3 of the coolest characters in the game are not only Russian, but also people trying to save the world from Solomon's harm, even if they fail in the game and succeed in the novel. I'll get into the novel a little later though. At first, most of the characters come off as generic and bland, but the more time you spend with them, the more there is to their character, most of the time. Now while the writers don't pull a Spec Ops The Line move in this campaign, but that's a whole different beast, they do a mostly decent job at fleshing out these characters for the most part. Take the characters of Blackburn and Montez for example. Blackburn might come off as an unlikable and cocky dude at first, but when things get serious and a bit heated, he shows his serious side, and that's where he becomes a compelling and a desperate character. When we're first introduced to Montez, he's very serious compared to the rest of the crew, but he still has that slight dude bro energy. He's cautious, and later on he can become quite intense. I mean, shout out to Ronan Summers, who is the actor that portrays Montez. He really sells this character, especially when we find the portable nuke case at the bank.
You know what that is? Russian. Portable nukes.
There's only one there.
Wait, there's room for 2 more. Where the hell are the other 2?
Hey, you need to see this!
There are some genuinely well-written moments of dialogue and characterization at times in this game. Some of these interrogation scenes, for example.
Jesus Christ, the nuke is still out there. Solomon's still out there. You can't just walk away from the threat.
You might be right, Sergeant. Maybe Solomon was too close to the fire, but I assure you we are on top of this situation. The Russians are a clear and present threat. Yes. What do you mean you lost a train?
They're dramatic, well-directed, and most of the acting is just spot on. And while I will admit that Battlefield 4 does a better job at fleshing out its characters in terms of personality and overall oomph, there are some interesting ways that Battlefield 3 gives context to its characters. Let's look at Sergeant Miller, who was first introduced in Thunder Run, and Vladimir Kamerevsky, who was first seen in Comrades and chronologically Kafarov, for example. We don't get to hear Miller speak throughout his time in the campaign, but due to how he's introduced and how his fellow squad mates respond to him, we get a little bit of his backstory and get an idea of his personality. Miller is a family man first and foremost. He wants to go home and be with them rather than be on this battlefield. We first see this as the mission titled Thunder Run opens with him playing with a toy from his son while he's in a tank. His squad mate kindly tells him to put the toy dinosaur down, followed by,
"It's gonna be alright, Miller. Yes, we'll be back in time for his birthday."
And as we come to the end of Miller's runtime, we learn that he's never going back home to his family, as he is used during Al Bashir's coup, where Solomon gives a monologue while holding the toy dinosaur, and he shortly slits his throat afterwards. It's kind of a hard-hitting death, knowing that a family man died quite brutally while also being used as a coup object. Vladimir, to me, is a really interesting and mysterious figure. Not much is known about him in the game, but according to his appearance and actions, we can tell that he is a smart, tough, and quick thinker who's been through some rough stuff. This is indicated by his cloudy eye, accompanied by some noticeable facial scars, implying that he is half blind. This guy is badass and one of the coolest Russians I've seen in the game, alongside Viktor Reznov from the Black Ops saga, Vladimir Makarov from the Modern Warfare trilogy, and of course Dima. Fun fact, he is also part Jewish too, born in Latvia. In the novel Battlefield 3 The Russian, we get to see more of Dima's perspective on the story. But the novel kind of skews events that happen in-game. Like in the novel, Vladimir doesn't die near the end of Comrades. Dima successfully disarms the nuke in Paris. Dima isn't involved with the Halo jump at the beginning of Kafarov. At the end of Kafarov, Blackburn interrogates Dima, and when Cole arrives, he goads Blackburn to kill Dima but still kills Cole. Kirill from Comrades is a completely different character named Kroll. So on and so forth. These changes did make The Russian an honestly weird experience to read, especially after going through Battlefield 3 a week before, like I did. But I'm happy we got to see more of what happened through Dima's eyes, as he is easily the best, most poetic, introspective, sensical, and one of the most intelligent characters in the campaign, alongside my boy Vladimir. Now, one character that I'll say needed better execution and slightly better writing is Solomon, the primary antagonist. This guy is the most cookie-cutter Russian antagonist I've ever seen in a first-person shooter campaign. He's generic in personality, and we don't even know what his motivations are, which frustrates me. Because the one important thing you would want to know about a dude who's trying to set off 2 portable nukes in New York City and Paris of all places is why. Why is this guy trying to set off nukes, and why is Paris an option? You'll never know. They don't even properly bring this up in The Russian, which is a bit baffling. We don't get much backstory of this guy except for the fact that he is a former CIA operative, which is mentioned in the game, and that Dima actually trained Solomon during the Soviet-Afghan war, which is mentioned in The Russian. He's as bland as an antagonist can be. He's definitely up there with Imran Sakayev and Al-Assad from the OG Modern Warfare for being the most boring and least exciting villains in a first-person shooter campaign. And I'll be mentioning those 2 names in a later video. Wink. It wouldn't even be an understatement to say that he's one of the most poorly executed parts of the campaign. Just the conflict overall in this game isn't properly fleshed out, and we are just left wondering why the hell all this is happening. Al-Bashir is made as such a big deal before he's betrayed and the focus shifts to Solomon. Sure, he has a very brief quote that asks a decent question.
Shame. You come to our country to murder us, yet we are the terrorists.
But other than that, he and the PLR are quite flat. Lastly, I want to talk about Blackburn. The Battlefield community has quite the reception to this guy, but it's not even because of his character for most of the time, but because of his character design. Everybody says he looks like a 40-year-old drug dealer who's addicted to crack, which, I'm not gonna lie, that's funny as all hell. Now yes, there were some people that criticized his character for being generic and dramatic, but I think that he's a decent character. Like I mentioned before, when the stakes are raised, he becomes a slightly more compelling, desperate, direct, and risky personality. It's a simple and decent character arc, yes, but it more than does the job. He goes from laid back and cocky to being on edge and a bit snappy. His backstory can be seen during loading screens, but they mostly refer to his father, Michael Blackburn, who we never see or hear of ever again. It's possible that Henry Blackburn from Battlefield 3 is related to Clyde Blackburn from Battlefield 1. Either that or it's just to serve as an Easter egg, who knows. What's nice about having a single player campaign in a primarily multiplayer shooter like Battlefield is that the campaign missions based on some of the multiplayer maps give some appreciative context and some type of backstory behind these battlefields. Like, why are we fighting in a crumbling Paris? Because one of the portable nukes that Solomon stole went off on one of the metro stations in the city. Why are we fighting in the Tehran highway? Because we're in the middle of a fictional battle for Tehran where the PLR took power over Iran. I love it when the single player serves as more than just a tutorial, but as a long prologue that's followed up by the more low-key narrative of the multiplayer. Although I do wish that some of the factions in the single player were carried over to the multiplayer, like the Gru faction, for example. What makes the campaign and multiplayer connection even more valid is how the multiplayer borrows music from core narrative moments in the campaign, most notably Solomon's theme. I'll talk about the soundtrack a little later though. Presentation is where this game gets extremely rough. This is where most of the drama surrounding this game's quality come into play. Even for a Battlefield campaign, Battlefield 3 is awfully linear, and this brings me to one of my biggest gripes with this game, its lack of replayability. Although Call of Duty campaigns can be quite linear, there is some subtle open-endedness where you can find collectibles and either get access to cheats which spices up the gameplay, or get some interesting and rewarding lore. Battlefield 3 has no collectibles or side content except for a co-op campaign which I've never played. On top of that, the fact that it's linear. This is actually a bad design choice on EA's behalf because Battlefield 3 was meant to advertise the power of the new Frostbite engine, showcasing large levels as well as dynamic and player-driven destruction. Yet, the levels here all feel like a straight and restrictive line that is filled to the brim with scripted moments. Even the destruction is scripted. Whether you're trying to make your tech demo look more cinematic or not, don't make some of your selling points preset, if you know what I mean. It doesn't look good and it's far from convincing. Then there's just some ridiculously stupid design choices. The QuickTime events, while very annoying, are manageable. But let me talk about the supposedly iconic level and set piece that people remember this campaign for. It's a little level known as Going Hunting. This mission is honestly kind of boring, and it shows just how much of a tech demo this game really is. The game doesn't allow you to walk with the pilot even though it's in first person and looks like gameplay. The devs literally can't trust you to control and follow the pilot like other FPS campaigns with these type of moments can. You board the plane, you can't control the plane, but you can only use its guns and its flares. Essentially, this is just a super long on-rails section, and I have to question why. This is a Battlefield game. We can commandeer a plane in multiplayer but not in the single player. Wouldn't taking control of the plane be a lot more impressive if you're showcasing the power of the Frostbite engine? I'm all for missions with some downtime moments, but when you're hyping up a level that you can only control 40% of, it heavily cripples the experience and the pacing. It's a terrible set piece, a terrible level, and a waste of time. Okay, so I'm actually in the process of getting the footage, meaning that I'm replaying this level at the moment. And while most of my points still stand, it's not a terrible set piece per se, nor is it a waste of time. I do see why people find this mission iconic and awesome, and the reception makes sense. It's quite exciting, and the audio design absolutely bangs on this level. The build up to the plane launch is also pretty cool, with the dialogue getting you ready for what's to come. But it's still a less than decent level gameplay wise, which is really disappointing. Okay, let's bring in some redeeming factors. There's the game's atmosphere. The campaign is immersive and sounds even better. The audio design might still be the best in the industry. Nearby gunfire is loud, but distant gunfire is snappy and echoes throughout the area, like a bunch of firecrackers going off in the distance. The campaign does a stellar job at making the player feel immersed in its levels, with a mostly minimal HUD, some great voice acting from squad mates that makes battles feel a bit more intense, and lastly, the soundtrack. The soundtrack is a banger and an absolute thrill. It's abrasive, there's a lot of synths, it's gritty, suspenseful, and sometimes beautiful. During some of the chaotic gameplay moments, the music is somewhat absent as the violence is soundtracked by gunfire and explosives. But during suspenseful, quieter or smaller scaled moments, and even set pieces, the music kicks in perfectly and just gives you goosebumps. Speaking of the set pieces, Battlefield 3 probably has some of my favorite in any military shooter. Unlike Call of Duty or to the original Modern Warfare, Battlefield 3's set pieces feel a lot more grounded and less over the top, which I very much appreciate. And the fact that the great set pieces are nicely spread out makes them feel even more rewarding and that more memorable. But then you get missions like Comrades, where the whole mission feels like just one well-directed set piece. Or the beginning of Kafarov, where D-Man and his trio go halo jumping with this big tube, and the Battlefield 3 main theme kicks in like a bat out of hell.
Дима, давайте дальше готовы.
Taking down Kafarov, although via quick-time events, was also entertaining nonetheless. To me, all Battlefield campaigns benefit from those set pieces and character moments that make a lasting impression. Yes, even Hardline does. I'm not going to touch too much on the gameplay since there's nothing special or innovative really, but I will applaud the gameplay variety that's on display here. What adds to some of the gameplay variety is also the different and sometimes unique settings in which we play through. Take Dima's missions, especially Comrades. Before this mission, you're fighting in war zones with your moderately sized squad. But in Comrades, you're fighting through a parking lot, an office building, and the streets of Paris, with only 2 guys by your side. There are some intense shootouts and set pieces throughout the campaign, and this level just goes full throttle. It's amazing. Dima's missions are honestly the best part of this campaign. If it has his fingerprint, presence, or name in it, it's bound to be good, at least in Battlefield 3. Throughout the campaign you have regular on-foot shootouts with some admittedly brain-dead AI. But then the game has these missions or long scripted moments where you control a tank or co-pilot a plane. Briefly stealth through a previous level that's been greatly altered, and later do a sniper mission. Oh, and let's not forget an AC on 30 time mission. The visuals during gameplay also hold up extremely well for a game released in 2011, especially for the fact that it's been dumbed down for the PS3 version that I'm playing. Although not flawless, there were many complaints about the game's blue tone filter and intense lens flare, to the point that the game was jokingly called Blue the Game. I honestly didn't have too much of a problem with this. It was a fairly minor annoyance on my part. In fact, it kind of enhanced the atmosphere of the game for me. Overall, gameplay wasn't too bad, neither was it near a masterpiece, but there are some fine things within it. I can more or less understand why this campaign didn't exactly click with everybody, why certain people trash it and other people praise it, and both views are very much justifiable. Sure, the story takes itself a little too seriously, but it's enjoyable, with some execution problems. Yes, it can be frustratingly linear and lacks replayability. Unfortunately, it does follow some military shooter tropes. And lastly, the enemy AI can be quite garbage, or incoherent at best. But on a positive note, there are many thrilling and memorable moments throughout. I feel like the story is near perfect on paper, without the strange and unnecessary narrative structure, and with more fleshed out antagonists. But in the final execution, it's still mostly great. The overall presentation during gameplay and narrative moments is still solid, and the game still looks really good for a 2011 game, even if the bluish art direction sometimes gets in the way. Battlefield 3's campaign is just a nice and more grounded action roller coaster to turn your brain off to, and admire the visual spectacle. It delivers some great moments, but is also plagued with some questionable cons. It's a fun campaign overall. I enjoyed it, other people enjoyed it, other people hated it. I don't think it's a masterpiece, but it's also far better than what Battlefield 4 is in terms of quality. Sometimes I feel like I'm the only person in the Battlefield community that really enjoys this campaign. And what I mean by really enjoy is that I've played this campaign over and over, and I've studied these characters. I fell in love with these characters. I even read through the novelization and I enjoyed it. There's some really good stuff in this campaign, and I feel like many people kind of brushed it off due to other issues or tropes that seem to overshadow everything else. Yes, it's not a masterpiece like I've mentioned before, but it's still an enjoyable experience that you should go through at least once from start to finish. That's all I have to say about this thrilling, epic, divisive, and infamous campaign from Battlefield 3.
Do not do anything stupid. This piece of shit right there stole 3 nuclear devices from Russia and sold it to a man called Solomon. Solomon's using the PLR. He has at least 2 targets, New York and Paris. He's using public transit to move the weapons. He's going to detonate the New York device at Times Square very soon. This cannot happen. We're gonna avert war between our nations. Just 2 of us. No politicians. No money changing hands. Just 2 soldiers speaking the truth. Help me. Help me to do this. That's it. I have to leave now. You don't shoot him, millions will die.
Get out of there!